The problem becomes when people try to legislate their sexual preferences or their lifestyles or their ambitions into a piece of law, when in fact homosexual rights become not the freedom to do what you want to do in the privacy of your own life, but become a restriction on me. It is therefore impossible for me, if a flaming gay walks into my house and wishes to sublet an apartment building I have, it is impossible for me to say no.
BCTV, 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 we're coming through for you.
Despite my smart aleck remarks at the beginning of the program, Barbara Amiel is a respected author and journalist. Macleans magazine, always a bit on the snappy side. I thought at first she was a women's libber, now I think she's an anti-feminist. I first came across her work, apart from Macleans, a magazine that I do not like, a magazine which I do not regard to be a great success as a Canadian news magazine, in a book called, written by Barbara Amiel, By Persons Unknown, which was on the sentencing for murder of a man called Demeter.
Peter Demeter.
Peter Demeter, who allegedly was proven to have murdered his wife.
To have hired persons or persons unknown to have murdered his wife, Christine.
And through that book came a thread of your unhappiness with the Canadian criminal justice system.
Yes, yes.
Is that so?
Yes, and multiculturalism, curiously enough, since you were just sniping away at that.
Tell me, are we going to agree on multiculturalism or not? Am I taking a WASP, smug, Scotch background look and denying other people the chance of getting federal money to build up their ethnic groups? Am I being unfair?
I would never have thought of you as a WASP, Jack. I always thought of WASPs as rather anemic, with rather thin, lanky bodies and three-piece suits. You don't fit my idea of a WASP at all.
And my background isn't that of a WASP either.
You don't speak like one. That's the problem. I've tried all my life to speak like one. It's very unsuccessful because I'm a mongrel too. But the question of multiculturalism, I think, is absolutely fundamental to this country, and we'll agree on it, simply because I think that it would take a blind, deaf and dumb man to assume that the government funding of people's roots, making roots a matter of public policy rather than of private policy, is a deliberate attempt to fragment the country, to offset the French minority in Quebec, to give the government power base, as much as the Democratic Party did in the United States. You get your assured votes, you get your Ukrainian vote, you get your Italian vote, you get patronage. And too bad that in the end the country dies over it. Too bad that the hostilities of the old world are brought into Canada. I talk about it in the book, and I talk about it with much unhappiness.
Well, this is the book. I don't know if they've seen it yet or not. They have. Confessions. I've seen that book.
Yeah.
You see, I remember once being told by one MP in opposition, it was Ron Huntingdon, who was a very outspoken right-wing Tory from the West Coast here, who had a brief moment of glory when they were in power for 5 minutes. And he's the only politician who's ever laid it on the line to me that there are 27 ridings, this was in the last election, in this country which control the government and which are, in his view, dependent on ethnic bloc voting.
Absolutely.
And from that, I take my line with Enrico, who's a nice guy. Nothing wrong with Enrico Diano.
Do you think he actually believes what he says? I mean, it's quite extraordinary. The people who are in the business of dividing the country wear this sanctimonious face and this sanctimonious smile and talk with hand on heart about unity. You see, you talk about power blocks and votes. That's the trees. That's the practical side of why you have multiculturalism. What I'm concerned with is the philosophical side of it and the results, the end results. And the end results, which are much more dangerous than simply seats in Parliament, are a social fabric stretched to breaking point. They're one group against another group. They're the Serbs against the Croatians. They're the East Indians against the blacks. There's this whole kind of stretching of the social fabric. And by God, it's done on taxpayers' money, and it's done at the government's instigation. And I think that the more malevolent aspect of it. And the more hideous question is, why does the government, not only for power reasons, want to keep this country in a state of internal strife? Why are they trying to destroy the strength and unity of Canada? I think there are two answers, and one of them is much more frightening than the simple answer of wanting to remain in power.
Mind you, you're a much more cynical Canadian than even I am, because as I recall this book, I just can't get the quote on it. You say at one stage, that you give the impression at one stage that you're so unhappy that you would leave this country in a flash because of your unhappiness with it.
No, it's not quite that, Jack. What I essentially say is that I'm not a nationalist in the old sense. I'm a wandering Jew. And that my allegiance is not to a group of trees or a rock, much as I love this country and its scenery. My allegiance isn't to a lake or to a geography. It is to a set of ideas and a philosophy. And as long as this country stands for free enterprise and liberty, then it has my allegiance, it has my life. But my suitcase is packed, because if in fact it is going to sell out free enterprise and sell out liberty, then I have allegiance only to that idea, and I will move on.
Well, why don't you pack your case now, because free enterprise is down the tube in this country?
I guess because I'm a fighter, because I think Canada is a smashing place. You know, if you come from Europe, it has a lot of old buildings and a lot of lovely ideas, but nothing beats the Canadian.
You know, this book is well worth reading because of the change in you. You started out in an affluent Jewish family, then you had family troubles, and you run off and you do all the humiliating little thing to give yourself a working class roots background, don't
Well, I didn't
you?
do it deliberately, Jack. I mean, one doesn't, in fact, embrace bread and dripping instead of caviar and salmon.
By choice.
Voluntarily, exactly.
And then from there you managed to slide your way into the media glib-libs, as you call them.
I wouldn't say slide, I'd say work my behind off, but yes.
In the CBC.
Yes,
for
even
which
in
you
the
have
CBC.
for which you have developed an astonishing scorn.
I don't think astonishing. Scorn, yes.
I mean, astonishing is an adjective, not astonishing in your eyes. A considerable scorn.
Yes.
What's wrong with the CBC these days? Mind you, you're only talking about the Eastern Media Mafia.
You know, being from the East is not like having syphilis.
Well,
there are
I don't
some
know.
good things in the East.
I'm not quite so sure about that, because the way they run the national news out of
True,
Ottawa
it
and
is
Toronto, you would think we had the social disease.
It is a dangerous social disease, and it is probably contagious given what it's doing to the characters of the people in this country. The reason I have unhappiness with the CBC and what is wrong with it, I guess what is wrong with it is that through a very understandable set of circumstances, everybody there believes very comfortably in the same thing.
What is that? Tell me, what is the unspoken policy of the CBC with which you were so familiar for so long?
Not remotely unspoken, spoken loud and clear.
What
it
is
is
it?
left-wing sentimental socialism.
Left-wing social democracy.
Yes.
Gay rights. You make a point of that in your book. Don't back off now.
I wouldn't say gay rights. I would say certainly radical feminism, a kind of misty-eyed embracing of everything that is third world, a feeling that income redistribution is what the country is all about. That
Native rights.
That the evils
Love
of the world...
Tom Berger.
Love Tom Berger, indeed. That the evils of the world can all be put down to capitalism and multinational corporations. A very simplistic kind of underdog mentality, except what they don't understand is that those aren't the underdogs anymore. And it's a sad thing because, you see, there are some very talented people at the CBC. There are talented producers. There are talented
I thought there was
story
only
editors.
Patrick Watson and nobody else.
Patrick Watson's a very interesting
Yeah, I know.
example of a man with considerable talent.
Undoubted.
Great skill, who could make the telephone book interesting if he read it, and sometimes is saying just as much as what the telephone book says, and is making it that interesting. But his ideas are the classic left-wing socialism ideas as well, packaged very nicely, and by God, we need people from the left. I'd be standing here screaming if the CBC had been taken over by the right. The problem is that they keep out everyone of an alternate opinion. Or they do one other thing, which is even worse. They get the little token conservative on, and they say, see, we are being fair. See, we are giving the other side of the opinion, and when they're not.
I cannot think of any program on CBC at this moment, or CTV, on which anyone exerts strong opinions.
Strong opinions are anathema in Canada. you know what they say if you have strong opinions? They write letters and they say things like, you should be on an open line show, as if somehow having strong opinions is consistent with the lowest common denominator in broadcasting.
Oh, I know.
There is an enormous fear in this country of having an opinion, unless it's the party line opinion.
Well, I could do the job out of Ottawa any moment for any government by standing up and saying, the government today introduced legislation to make everybody 3'6" in height. And the intention of that legislation is so-and-so. Then you pat at the line. Then you
Frankly,
take
Jack, I think you're to blame in one way. You
blame me after the break.
You bother because you have a very old-fashioned idea of right and wrong, words which are no longer used in politics, in policy, or in decision-making.
Right.
You're a dying breed, Jack.
For the purpose of editing, we shall now start this segment of the interview again after a 3-second delay. Barbara Amiel, you were telling me that I am to blame for some of this malaise which afflicts the media.
Yes, because you sit here in your own malaise in Vancouver when I know perfectly well that you have been offered network cross-country exposure which would at least do something to balance the monopoly of the media by the left wing, and you sit here very comfortably in Vancouver, can't blame you, refusing to go live on network. Now, since there are so few people who have that opportunity, who are given that offer of your view and your persuasion, I think that you have a responsibility, in fact, to make your views known across the country.
Go jump in the lake.
Oh, but I've been told that so often, Jack, you'll have to say something much worse.
Are you telling me that there's only one Webster-type commentator available across this country? Don't be silly. I mean, Pierre Berton in his day could have done it, but he's doing so many things and he doesn't like to do the pedestrian daily
Pierre Berton
jobs
is a
anyway.
social democrat. Fine, respectable position to take, but simply one of 3 dozen that we already have on the network.
I am a left-winger by definition, rapidly moving to the right, however.
You may be a classic liberal.
I never thought of that. I'm not a liberal. I want you to get that quite clear.
That's a capital L liberal,
Yeah.
but they're not liberals either. The capital L liberals in this country are, in fact, social democrats, well on their way to scientific socialism if they get a chance. They're going to regulate you to death, Jack.
All right, let's get some annoying stuff from you now, from your book. Bare your chest on how you rigged Trudeau's election.
I beg your pardon, it's just that I'm not quite used to these phrases.
Well, this is what you call a topless show. Sometimes people's heads get taken off.
If it will help the cause of freedom, I'm delighted
Please,
it's true.
misunderstand. I'm not blushing. I blush so easily, it's appalling. Next thing. Tell the story of how you rigged the poll on Pierre Trudeau and may have played a not insignificant part in his election as leader in 1968.
Cruel, cruel. It is true that I rigged the CBC poll. I was a story editor on the CBC Sunday night primetime show. And I had a very keen producer by the name of Peter Herendorf, a first-rate producer who is now the second man in charge at the CBC. And they had a terrific idea. We were going to go on air right before the Liberal Leadership Convention. And what they wanted to do was call up every delegate to the Leadership Convention, find out how they were going to vote, and announce on CBC Network who the next leader of the Liberal Party was going to be before the convention began. And they put me in charge of it, a deadly mistake. I started organizing our researchers to call everybody up, and we telephoned and telephoned, but quite rightly, the delegates refused to tell us who they were going to vote for. This was not good enough for my producer, Peter Herendorf, a man of some determination, and he came to me in my office and said, Amiel, you can do it. Now, I knew that he'd had a lot of expensive electronic equipment installed in the CBC studios so that the computers would light up and flash who the next leader was going to be, and that if I didn't come up with a name, his head was going to be on a platter for that expensive equipment, or my head. And I kind of thought that given the choice between his head and my head, it was going to be my head.
Right.
So I sat down and decided that the only way out of this situation was to make up the votes, because no one was going to tell us. And I tried to think how I could get away with a lie, and it occurred to me that if you give people the lie they want to hear, they won't check into it. And the lie that everybody wanted to hear at that time was that Pierre Elliott Trudeau was going to win. He was trendy. He wore turtleneck sweaters. He talked about keeping the state out of the bedrooms of the nation.
He was going to decriminalize marijuana.
Never mentioning that the state was going to go into every other room in the house.
Right.
He was going to decriminalize marijuana. He was swinging. He was a bachelor. God knows he might be doing it with beached whales. It was a marvelous thing to have this kind of liberation. And so I wrote down in our forms that Pierre Elliott Trudeau was going to win the nomination. The producer was delighted. I have no idea whether he was a confirmed Liberal or not. That wasn't the point. He wanted Trudeau. And CBC announced to the nation on Sunday night that Pierre Elliott Trudeau was going to win the Liberal leadership campaign. Now, all the other delegates, all the other contenders rather, screamed like crazy. And a memo came down from head office saying, would you please explain how you arrived at this decision? But by the time the memo came from Ottawa to Toronto, given internal mail as well as external mail, Pierre Elliott Trudeau had been elected, and there wasn't a Liberal in sight who wasn't willing to say that they had voted for him. I don't feel, and I think it's cruel of you, because in fact I have agonized over this, it was a reprehensible thing to do.
It was.
It showed a kind of character flaw that I suppose I wear a hair shirt for.
How old
now.
were you at the time? 10 years, 12 years ago?
I was 26.
You hadn't been in the
I'm
business
39
that long.
now, but I was 26 the way it felt.
You've been in the business, what, 6 years?
I was old enough to know better. I'd been in the business long enough to know better. There was no excuse. It was based on what our politicians base things on now. Expediency,
If you'd
pragmatism,
handled
and
that
my own-
properly in Ontario political circles, you could have become a senator.
Oh, I know.
That is a cruel remark. But you know, it makes one to shudder, and I've never been as guilty of anything such as you have done. But I've no doubt that I've pushed my own prejudices on occasions and caused a change in things which might not have come around. But you were just being an opportunist.
I was just being an opportunist.
Or perhaps you sensed the thing correctly. Perhaps
Yes.
your poll would have been right had it been honest.
Well, of course, if it had been honest, it probably would have shown Pierre Elliott Trudeau as well.
Winters.
Ah, wishful thinking, Jack. But I put my finger in my mouth, held it
No,
up to
I
the
hated
wind.
Winters. I didn't like Winters. In those days, I regarded him as he came from Brinko and Churchill Falls, and he was Bay Street capitalism of the highest order. We looked very suspiciously at this man Trudeau in those days, and my first couple of press conferences I had with him when he was Minister of Justice were total and absolute disasters.
It is an absolute wonder to me how the Canadian people have swallowed the really anti-democratic things that Trudeau has said and continue to re-elect him.
How tough will I be? Just watch me after the break. Coffee's cold. See this new cup? It makes cold coffee. There's somebody here who makes coffee
That's
with
progress for you.
cold water. Some person made it.
Yes.
Give me your
coffee person.
Give me your CBC line on that, please.
Well, there was a memo that came out from the CBC about a month, maybe 2 months ago, from the office of Al Johnson, the president of the CBC. And it appears that the radical feminists have taken over the CBC because the memo was a directive to all producers, all creative people, on how they were now to portray women in CBC news, variety, drama, public affairs. You can no longer use certain words in CBC. You can't use mankind because that's a sexist word. You can't use man-made. You cannot portray women according to their physical attributes, nor men according to their professional ones, whatever the hell that means. I think, as I said in the column, that it means that if you see a woman in a tight sweater on CBC, and chances are you won't anymore, you have to show a man blow-drying his hair in the same scene. What is really behind it, I think...
It's frightening.
It is frightening because, you see...
Is this to de-sex the whole nation?
You see, it is an insult to women. I happen to be a feminist. I want equal pay for the same job. I don't want a job denied to me because I am a woman. But I don't want to feel humiliated and made to feel that equality depends on me hiding my sexual identity. I take a great deal of pride in my gender. I think, like millions of women and men in Canada, we enjoy our differences. Those differences tend to be harmless, often quite enjoyable, and are a sense of pride to us. But the CBC, who has been taken over by this group of radical feminists who apparently have cornered Al Johnson so that he is issuing these idiotic studies, appointing vice chairman or something in charge of the portrayal of women, and otherwise squandering
Why don't we call them
dearly needed
things?
money.
Vice chair things.
Vice chair things?
Vice chair things instead of vice chairpersons.
I'll tell you why you won't.
Canada thing power.
Because the women's feminist movement at the University of Toronto, the women's commissioner there, just had a statement printed in which she said in the U of T newspaper that she wished she could see Barbara Amiel smeared in an article. Smeared. Now that's one sister to another sister. Not I wish I could see her debated, not I wish I could see her arguments attacked, but smeared, which is a word that means, as far as I know, distorted,
That's right.
A below-the-belt thing.
Slandered, maligned,
Yeah.
destroyed.
These professional women's movement people, that whole industry, has a kind of fascist overtone. Our opinion, right or wrong attitude. There is no free play, and I think that's probably why the government embraces
the old
it.
radical militant union technique. If you're not with them, you're a fascist.
Yes, absolutely.
And if you're not with them, you're a fascist, I
But
suppose.
isn't that the attitude right across Canada on so many things now?
I don't think it permeates nearly so badly as in the media, for instance.
No.
Another thing that concerns me a little bit, the time that the Mayor of Toronto made these unfortunate remarks, or fortunate remarks, I forget the circumstances now, about homosexuals. And suddenly you begin to see coverage out of CBC Toronto, and I remember this specifically, which made me think, are there any straight people in Toronto?
There is-
Began to look like San Francisco, where there are 177,000 gays, registered voters, who run that city, and where they've got the media in a total bind. Now, I object to any kind of misrepresentation of numbers, whether it's about criminals, drugs, or sexual preferences. Because television is so damnably powerful. You can make the people in Pouce Coupé think, my God, we're being terribly unfair to all kinds of people to whom we perhaps should be terribly unfair.
It is true that there does, if you read the literature of our land and watch the television, appear to be a severe shortage of those of heterosexual inclinations. And certainly the talk in the women's clubs these days is of the severe shortage of people of heterosexual inclinations. But
Maybe it's just a fad.
Of
Maybe
course,
it's a pretend.
of course, you see, what it is, in fact, is a preoccupation with trends. And I personally, as I have said on numerous occasions, really don't care if people do it with men, women, or the proverbial beached whales. That's a personal decision.
As long, who was it that said, you may do what, was it Campbell? George Bernard Shaw's correspondent, Mrs. Dorothy Campbell, who said, doesn't really matter what you do, you may do it in the streets as long as you don't frighten the horses.
Yes.
Mrs.
Or possibly
Patrick
do it
Campbell.
with the horses.
Mrs. Patrick Campbell.
The problem becomes when people try to legislate their sexual preferences or their lifestyles or their ambitions into a piece of law, when in fact homosexual rights become not the freedom to do what you want to do in the privacy of your own life, but become a restriction on me. It is therefore impossible for me, if a flaming gay walks into my house and wishes to sublet an apartment building I have, it is impossible for me to say no. Now, I think I'm stupid if I say that, because why should I care?
No,
I
but
want the
you
right
can
to
say
be
no.
stupid.
As long as you don't say no, you're not getting it because you're a flaming gay. You can say no, providing you give no reason and have your lawyers at your side.
But you see, once in fact you have homosexual rights, it becomes almost impossible to prove that it wasn't because of a person's. You can neither hire nor fire people without taking into account the arrangement of their reproductive organs and what they do with them. The whole problem...
Surely it's not as bad on the coast yet.
Which coast are we talking
This
about?
coast.
This coast, I don't know about Vancouver. You just have these other problems with human rights. You have restaurants being closed up because they're called Honk is Heaven or something, don't you?
Yeah, crazy. And we also have an incredible prostitution problem, which some people seem to be campaigning for.
Well, I don't know what the problem is with
It's a
prostitutes.
pest.
I mean,
It's unseemly.
but don't
it's
they stick
disgusting.
to their own habitat?
No.
Because I spent a long time in Vancouver. I was out here a few months ago, and I went looking for the Vancouver prostitutes. And I went looking for them not in the areas where they were supposed to be, but on the streets late at night. And I was with a group actually of Toronto criminal lawyers who showed a rather unnatural interest, I thought, in trying to find potential
At least
clients.
they weren't judges.
And we couldn't find them. I find that this
Must have been a wet night in the winter.
was actually a warm night in the summer.
Well, they'd already been booked up by all the tourists. Webster and Barbara Amiel after the break. I suppose we should take some phone calls to Barbara Amiel, so you might put up the number sometime or another. We've only got 15 minutes, less commercials, but interesting. Let's be a little lighter. It is a confessional, this book, you know, because you tell the story, and I don't want you to tell it now, of an abortion, your own abortion, and you're against abortion now that you've grown up. Is that right?
I was against it at the time, Jack. I just had another one of those pragmatic decisions based on what was expedient for me.
How old were you?
I guess I was about 24.
There was a kitchen table abortion?
It was a back room one, complete with, as I describe in the book, the black rubber apron, actually the naked light bulb. It was a fairly hideous experience, yes.
Wouldn't do it again.
No, the gods have been cruel to me, or the gods are probably being correct. Now that I want a child, it is very difficult to have one.
Isn't that funny?
I think there is a certain natural justice in the world that gets around to you in the end.
You are Jewish.
Yes.
You called yourself a wandering Jew earlier on.
Yes.
But you haven't done that much wandering, just wandering in Canada, apart from your reportorial travels.
I've done some wandering intellectually. And I suppose that's the sense that I mean it. I mean, when you go from the far left, when you go from communism to classic liberalism, you wander in that sense.
Were you a commie at one time?
I was never a card-carrying member. I was certainly at many communist gatherings, and I certainly believed in Marxism. I really thought it was going to provide heaven on earth.
Justice.
Justice.
Equality.
Decent. Well, you know, the whole thing, you use all these words to mask the most hideous of causes. It's the Jane Fonda syndrome. We talk about all the good things in life, and we say it with gleaming eyes.
See how they didn't switch after the Vietnam War, and how the North Vietnamese very cleverly dumped their problems in Cambodia and North America?
But the North Vietnamese told Miss Fonda, and indeed told the world, what they intended to do with Vietnam during the 60s. They made no secret of their plans for population redistribution, as they called it. There were even signs that the Greater Vietnamese Empire, i.e. the invasion of Cambodia, was going on. They made no secret of it. That is why those of us who were against the Vietnam War were anti-North Vietnam. We found that it was possible to say, listen, we really wish the United States wasn't there.
You have a couple of funny stories in it. Tell me the circumstances about Jane Fonda in this country.
Well, I mentioned in the book that I was having breakfast with Miss Fonda in New York. At the time, I was living with a gentleman who was a film director, and he was interviewing Miss Fonda for a part in a movie script, and I was in the kitchen squeezing the fresh orange juice and being ever so domestic, a role into which I do not slip easily. And Miss Fonda was in the front room talking about the totalitarian Canada. And it was just after the War Measures Act, and I explained, my boyfriend knew absolutely nothing about politics, he only knew about actors, and he called out to me, is Canada going totalitarian? And I didn't know whether it was or wasn't, but I tended to feel that we should wait and see. Bombs had gone off in Montreal. I didn't know what the War Measures Act was. And so I made some vague remarks about it. And Jane Fonda remarked that she had a headache. All this business about Trudeau and the totalitarianism and creeping fascism was getting to her. So I went trotting off to the bathroom, and I came back with a bottle of 222s with codeine in them. I gave her 2 tablets, a cup of coffee, and 10 minutes later, a serene Miss Fonda said to me, what was in those tablets? And I said, codeine, Miss Fonda, and you can get them over the counter in Canada. And that was ever so good, because she was going off to Montreal to make a speech, and while she was there, she picked up 3 bottles or whatever of 222s and came back to America, and lo and behold, at the airport they searched her baggage, and codeine in US is a controlled substance, so Miss Fonda was delayed for importing drugs over the border. And I say it now, and I said it in the book, and I've received a lot of flack for this, but A warm glow filled me when I heard that Miss Fonda had been detained at the airport because I had told her to buy C2s or 222s. A warm glow because, you see, the woman, in fact, splendid actress that she is, was advocating the cause of murderers and continues to advocate the cause of murderers and will not repent, and millions of people lie dead and lie without homes while dear Miss Fonda goes on the road advocating their cause.
Barbara Amiel, author of Confessions. After the break. No bloody way. Give me a one-word opinion on the human rights phenomenon which sweeps across this country with regularity each and every hysterical day.
3, lethal and selfish.
Thank you. Go ahead to Barbara Amiel.
You just took the wind out of my sails. That's what I was going to ask Barbara. By the way, you're a breath of fresh air besides being lovely.
Thank you very much.
And enjoy you immensely. In fact, I'm going out to purchase your book. One of the things that really bothers me as a Canadian is this Civil Rights Union and this BC Rights or BC Human Rights Commissions. They scare the hell out of me because they're encroaching upon the freedoms of the people.
Yep, I talk about them in the book as the thought police, and I'm afraid that's what it is. They use a terrific phrase, human rights, but in fact what they're doing is denying you human rights, and I think it's lethal.
Thank you. Go ahead, please.
Hello. Miss Amiel, I was very, very surprised to hear you say that you were visiting Vancouver several months ago, and it was a warm evening. I was just wondering if that's this year or last year.
It was this year. I think it was in June, and it was quite lovely.
Oh, it was. Oh, that's nice. Coming from Toronto, of course, you probably thought it was warm.
Is that your contribution to the debate, ma'am?
No, it isn't.
What's your point?
It's about the prostitution
Yes.
thing. Your article in Macleans magazine,
Yes.
I burst into flames. And I wrote a letter to you, then I decided against it. But I'm glad you're here because I want to mention the fact that I'm a citizen. I'm also one of the victimized residents in West End of these people. We live in an apartment block. It's not Georgia Street, it's Jervis Street, off Davie. We have at least 6 prostitutes outside our apartment window every night. Now, if you would like to know this, I'd like to invite you up to our apartment.
What?
I'll give you a front seat, and you can have a look at them. Then you'll be able to see that we do have prostitutes.
What are the problems that they cause you?
Traffic, the voyeurs, the drunken men until 4 o'clock in the morning, going by, squealing their wheels.
Fair enough. Now, would you agree? Fair enough. That's a problem. But would you agree to legalizing it and removing them to an area of the city
Oh,
where they?
definitely. And I'm not against prostitution. Neither am I against motherhood.
Well, I actually, as I said in the article, have an innate dislike of prostitution. But
No,
what
I noticed that.
What I suggested was, in fact, that if our ministers really cared about relieving the kind of problem, the legitimate problem that you're talking about, they would legalize it and put it in an area of the city where they wouldn't
You're
bother
also
you.
going to legalize 15-year-old drag queens, 16-year-old transvestites,
That's called
and all
an
the rest of them.
ad hominem argument.
It's
Jack.
not an ad hominem
You're-
argument. What we want in a civilized society, we certainly don't want a red light district and buying stock, as you do in West Germany, in a whorehouse of some kind. We're well aware that prostitution exists. A moment, please. We must have it under some form of social control, and there's a perfectly simple way to do it. You bring back straight soliciting, the police nab them from time to time, put them in jail, check them for VD, then they go out and they come back and pay the lawyers with a collection of $2 or $5 or $10 bills.
But you don't solve this lady's
But
problems.
yes, we do. We take them off the street on every occasion for simple soliciting. We harass them within the law nicely. We don't try and ban prostitution, but we don't want a public relations firm setting up in Vancouver or preferably in Toronto saying, you want to be a first-class hooker? I got the very house for you in the city of Vancouver, where they have a beautiful modern red light district where you'll have your medical examinations every day, where you make enough money to retire in your RRSPs at 55 or 25, because people like myself, squares and horrible though we are, have a moral and rooted objection to encouraging the legalization of the debasement of the human body.
I do think it's the debasement of the human body, and very eloquently put,
Thank
but
you, ma'am.
beside the point.
You'd legalize it.
I'd legalize it with much unhappiness, but I'd save that lady's problems, and in fact I'd cope with the realities of the situation. Your problem, your cure is worse than the disease, because in the end you will distort the law in your
No, I
cure.
won't. I'll make the law simply enforceable on a license fee basis without giving a public acknowledgement to the legalization of whorehouses. Let's call it what it is. And the disease in this town is endemic and rampant from these disgusting, unfortunate human beings,
Well, if
male
you're-
and female, on the streets.
If you're worried about disease, you will legalize it so you can license and check them up. Your suggestion is when you catch them after
Put
the
them
act.
through the mill. First time we've disagreed this morning. I'm astonished at your low moral attitude on this.
Well, of course, I am a creature that crawled out of the gutter.
No, you're not. You came from an affluent Jewish family. It
But I
said
went
so in
back into-
Confessions. Only for show and experience. You're not legitimate working class like me. Are we finished? A very good book, Barbara Amiel, Confessions. I enjoyed it thoroughly. You are, I don't think you're any more of a neo-fascist than I am. And you may take that any way you wish. Webster after break.